After sighting land, the course steered actually took us soon after dark within a short distance of the rocks off Cape Border, so near that the breakers could be seen and heard. Seeing the imminent danger to which we were exposed, Captain Duff and my father took upon themselves to have the vessel's course altered with all possible speed, and after a few moments of painful suspense, the ship was put about and was headed seaward again. After daylight next morning, we made for Investigator Straits and had the pleasure of sailing along Kangaroo Island, which was in sight nearly all day.
G'day, I'm Peter.
And g'day, I'm Greg.
Welcome to Today's Stories from Our Past, a podcast about a history of Australia from about 1800 onwards.
So in the last episode, we talked about Dr. George Mayo and his connection with the Watts family. We also talked about the voyage out to Australia and the Asia and his subsequent life in South Australia. And much of that story was taken from his diary.
Yeah. In July 1839, Mayo boarded a migrant ship, the barque the Asia, bound for South Australia. He kept a detailed diary about that trip. He wrote some interesting stuff about life on board a migrant ship. In the last episode, we covered Mayo's duties as the ship's surgeon and some events that happened during the voyage, including a pirate attack. These sections of his diary could have been submitted to his employer as a record of the voyage. But Dr. Mayo must have been confident that no one would ever read his diary. He makes lots of candid comments about the captain, the crew and the passengers. Mayo was in a unique position to observe and comment on everybody on board. As ship's surgeon, he had to attend to all people on board, regardless of their position in society. Except perhaps for the captain, no one else mixed with all classes as he did. The cabin passengers generally kept to their cabins or were on the top deck. Steerage passengers stayed below decks, except for getting some exercise on deck, and the busy crew had their own quarters in the forecastle. Of course, they passed each other from time to time on deck, but no one communicated with all those on board like the ship's surgeon.
That's true. So what did the good doctor write in his diary?
Lots. I'll group the entries as per the grouping of people on board, namely the cabin passengers, the steerage passengers below decks, the crew, and finally the captain.
Okay. Well, who were the cabin passengers?
These are the people that Dr. Mayo dined with every day. In addition to himself, they included Captain Freeman and his son, Captain Duff, his wife and infant, the Garrett clan, and a Mr. Armitage. As I said, I'll leave the captain till last. Very little is said about Mr. Armitage. Mayo wrote in his diary,
Mr. Armitage is a young lawyer going on to Sydney. He is good-looking, rather dark, and very gentlemanly manner, and seems rather well read in history, etc. He is not quite sure about remaining in South Australia.
Well, that was brief. So what can you tell me about Captain Duff and his family?
This is the same Captain Duff who commanded the Africaine and let my ancestor, Charles Nantes, and 5 others off the vessel at Cape Border on the western end of KI. We've told the tale of that adventure in episodes 5 and 6. On this voyage, John Finlay Duff is just a cabin passenger, accompanied by his wife Anne and infant child Jessie Light Duff. The child's middle name is obviously in honour of Colonel Light. Jessie was born on 29 November 1838 in London, so she was only a few months old during the voyage. Dr. Mayo recorded a few comments about Captain Duff specifically. He wrote,
Monday, March 18th. Captain Duff, aged 39. He is rather a pleasant, mannerly man. Not very much to say for himself except when shipping or anything on that subject is broached. Monday, April 22nd. Captain Duff is a very pleasant man when you come to know him. No nonsense about him, and I do not think him capable of saying anything to hurt a person's feelings.
Well, Mayo seems to have a fairly good opinion about Captain Duff. What does he say about his wife?
Mayo writes about Mrs Duff several times in his diary. His comments are not always over-complimentary. Here's a few of them.
Tuesday, March 19th. Mrs Duff is a nice, lively woman. Like most women, rather vain. She is not very pretty, but there is a very neat style about her. She comes from Chepstow, partly educated in Bath. She prides herself, I think, on her knowledge of music and dancing and even in the languages. She has rather a pretty voice. Her baby is like her husband, therefore, not very beautiful. Friday, April 26th. Mrs Duff is an awful talker, and when people talk so much, they must sometimes talk foolishness. Poor Mrs Duff has the great weakness of speaking so much of herself. Wednesday, May 1st. When Mrs Duff is talking to one, she rolls her eyes about so much. I have now come to the conclusion that she thinks it looks interesting. Sunday, June 23rd. Called up last night to Mrs Duff's infant. Read prayers. Mrs Duff was talking about her father as having been very eccentric. I asked if he was alive, and she said, yes, but dead to her. Sunday, June 30th. Mrs Duff makes use of every Sunday evening for writing out recipes from the cookery book. Captain Duff married 3 years. Monday, July 1st. Mrs Duff becomes daily more nervous about the weather and our landing safe. Friday, July 5th. Mrs Duff very vain. Speaking of stays, she once was considered a very pretty figure. When people talk so much, they must talk nonsense.
Well, Dr. Mayo has some reservations about Mrs Duff, and I assume that comment, Captain Duff married 3 years, means that it was their third wedding anniversary.
Yep. Now we need to talk about the other cabin passengers. This is what I call the Garrett clan, as I'm not exactly sure how many of them there are and how they are related to a large family in steerage, the Olivers.
Okay, tell me about them.
Well, let's start with the father, Richard Garrett. Here's a few comments that George Mayo wrote about him.
Sunday, March 10th. The captain, etc. returned in the evening. Mr Garrett was rather fresh. He struck his wife once or twice in her face in their cabin, so Mrs Duff said. Thursday, March 21st. Mr Garrett and family occupy the left after cabin. He seems rather passionate and has a tremendous nose. He is, I think, very good-hearted, but seems fond of grog, not that he ever gets tosy, as I have seen. He seems to think a great time of pounds, shillings and pence. Friday, May 3rd. Mr Garrett is rather a queer-tempered man, sometimes whacking his children and then cussing.
It sounds as though Mr Garrett doesn't mind a bit of physical violence towards his wife and children. That doesn't sound great. By the way, does tosy mean what I think?
Yep. Tosy is an adjective that means slightly intoxicated or tipsy. Nobody uses that phrase nowadays.
Okay. And what did Mayo say about his wife?
Mayo does make an early diary entry about her. He wrote,
Friday, March 22nd. Mrs Garrett is rather a fine-looking woman, rather tall and regular features, but very little manner. Cannot have been in much society. Still, she is rather pleasing. Her children are rather pretty. I do not think she understands music or any other feminine accomplishment out of the common way.
Sounds as a bit as though Mayo thinks that Mrs Garrett is a bit common, let's say to be a cabin passenger, certainly quite different to Mrs Duff. So did everyone get along on the voyage? After all, they were stuck together in a small cabin areas for 5 months straight.
George Mayo does make several diary entries where Mrs Duff and Mrs Garrett are both mentioned. Here's a few.
Saturday, March 16th. Mrs Garrett and Mrs Duff are rather sick and shy of their meals. Thursday, April 4th. Mrs Duff and Mrs Garrett do not agree very well. It is a pity, but women are queer beings to each other, until one acknowledges the other's superiority. Monday, April 29th. Mrs Duff and Mrs Garrett always in opposition. The bone of contention now is Mrs Garrett's nursemaid not showing sufficient respect to Mrs Duff. Saturday, June 1st. Mrs Garrett ran foul of Mrs Duff and nearly knocked her down. Mrs Duff said she did it on purpose and blew up Mr Garrett because he would not blow up his wife. Sunday, June 2nd. Mrs Duff told me she did not believe that the two oldest of Mrs Garrett's children were Mr Garrett's. She said there was some mystery about it. Saturday, June 8th. Mrs Duff told me that she went up to Mrs Oliver, the mother of Mrs Garrett, and said to her suddenly that Mr Garrett is Mrs Garrett's second husband. Mrs Duff said the old woman coloured up to her eyes and said yes, it was. I made the remark that women were terrible hands at finding out anything about a person and ran away for fear she should get anything out of me. Saturday, June 15th, an unpleasant head sea. Mrs Garrett ran up and snatched Mrs Duff's child out of her arms and hugged it and kissed it. Rather surprised lookers on. Tuesday, June 18th. Mrs Duff and Mrs Garrett are now sworn friends.
Well, that sounds like a few melodramas that were played out in the cabin area during the voyage. I guess that's to be expected with everybody on top of each other for such a long period.
Yeah. And Mayo didn't mind recording what he thought about some of the steerage passengers as well in his diary. Here's a few of his observations.
Wednesday, April 3rd. Mr Oliver, my mate, has been a farmer in Suffolk. He has his passage from the South Australia Commission and a large family besides, namely 4 young women and 4 young men. I have just understood that Mrs Garrett in the cabin is a daughter of his. It is a fine family. Tuesday, April 16th. Captain Freeman has allowed the Miss Olivers to come on the poop, and their mother. They seem nice girls enough, but not much manner. Thursday, April 25th. Mr Armitage flirts with Miss C. Oliver for want of something better to do. She is a very buxom wench. Mr Pennington, second mate, flirts with Miss E. Oliver. Rather fine girl. I like the eldest the best, but no more flirting for me. I was in hot water enough last voyage to give me a sickness. Wednesday, May 8th. Charles Oliver assaulted Mr Roberts on the forecastle, and, as the complaint came, knocked him down and kicked him last night after dark. This morning, I was called to Mr Letts, whom Mr Charles Oliver had struck and made his face bleed, and, as the complaint came, it was done without any provocation. I had the parties into the cabin before myself and the captain. A knife belonging to a young man of the name of Frost seemed to be the bone of contention, and after hearing what both parties had to say, we warned Charles Oliver of the consequences of taking the law into his own hands. Thursday, May 9th. The migrants are generally tired of each other and themselves. We make such slow progress. The men say they never knew their wives show such temper. Tuesday, May 21st. The migrants have a bit of a quarrel sometimes, but we have not the dogs for uproar as we had last voyage. A shift of wind on a sudden. The migrants rushed on deck to assist after turning in. Wednesday, June 19th. Lemon. An impudent blackguard, and his wife nearly as bad. Thursday, July 4th. When women drink anything more than usual, it were vain their pretty tongues to tire. It is a bad habit ladies get into the way of, on board, drinking.
It sounds as if some of the women were a bit worse for wear. At least we're getting a better understanding of the social norms of that era. Do you know what the phrase that Mayo used there means? It were vain their pretty tongues to tire?
I was very interested in that. I googled it. It's a reference to an essay on criticism. There's a whole wiki page about this poem. The poem was written by Alexander Pope in 1711. It's the source of the famous quotations, "To err is human, to forgive divine. A little learning is a dangerous thing," which is frequently misquoted as "a little knowledge is a dangerous thing." And "fools rush in where angels fear to tread."
Oh, okay. The good doctor's clearly a learned chap, but you haven't discussed the crew yet. What do you know about them?
Well, as far as I can determine, there were 34 crew members, including the captain. They can be broken down into 3 groups. Firstly, there are those in charge, namely the captain, then the first, second and third mates. The first mate was a Mr Simpson, the second mate was Mr Pennington, and the third mate was Freeman's son Benjamin. We'll talk about the captain separately later on. The first mate acted as second in command to the captain. He oversaw daily operations of the deck crew, managed navigation, ensured safety on board, and took control when in the captain's absence during emergencies. Essentially, he was the vice captain of the vessel. Next, there were the crew who prepared and served the meals to the cabin passengers. The steerage passengers had to manage for themselves. The cook was Robert Lifgate. The steward, who served the meals to the cabin passengers, was a Mr Furness, and then there was a boy who assisted them. Finally, there are the sailors. This group included a carpenter, a boatswain, a sailmaker, and a couple of boys as well. The boatswain was a senior crew member responsible for overseeing the deck department, maintaining the ship's rigging, sails, anchors, boats, and all that deck equipment and stuff, essentially ensuring the smooth operation and safety of all deck-related activities on the vessel. He was essentially the leader of the deck crew and managed the day-to-day operations there.
Okay, and that sounds like a fair number needed to sail the Asia. What does Dr Mayo have to say about them?
Mayo doesn't say all that much about this crew who sailed the vessel, but he does make a few comments about those who served the meals. Here's a few comments about them.
Sunday, March 24th. The first mate, Mr Simpson, is a sturdy, stocky fellow about 35 or about, pleasant enough, but I should think a queer one if put out of the way. Monday, March 25th. The second mate, Mr Pennington, aged 20. He's a genteel-made young man, very consequential. His father lives at Camberwell and is a watchmaker. Sunday, May 5th. The steward and cook got a blowing up about the tea water through my complaining. Monday, May 13th. The steward is a half-caste and a greater brute could not possibly have been found. His attentions are more disagreeable, and his brutality, and when the captain speaks to him, he is saucy. It serves him right. Wednesday, June 26th. After dinner, Mrs Garrett accused the steward of striking one of her children. He said it was false several times before Captain Freeman and Mr Garrett. Saturday, June 29th. An awful row this evening between Captain Freeman and Mr and Mrs Garrett about the steward.
Well, it seems that the steward was not the most congenial of fellows, and Captain Freeman doesn't do much to improve his behaviour towards the cabin passengers.
Yes, it seems that the captain should have stepped in there. Nevertheless...
Okay, well, I assume it's time to talk about the captain now.
Well, not quite yet. There's something else to mention first. On 11 April 1839, the Asia crossed the line. You'll remember from our previous episode that just 10 days earlier, they were attacked by pirates and were saved by the actions of Captain Duff rather than the ship's actual captain, Captain Freeman. The term crossing the line means crossing the equator, and a line crossing ceremony is typically held on that day. The line crossing ceremony was, and still is, an initiation rite that commemorates a person's first crossing of the equator. The tradition may have originated as a test by seasoned sailors to ensure their new shipmates were capable of handling long, rough voyages. Equator crossing ceremonies typically featured King Neptune. Throughout history, line crossing ceremonies have sometimes been like dangerous hazing rituals.
Yeah, well, I've heard of that event, a good distraction from the boredom. But what happened on the Asia when they crossed the line?
Well, Dr Mayo simply recorded in his diary,
April 11th. Our captain has given orders that there shall be no shing or shaving on crossing the equator. Wind, south and variable. Thermometer, 82 degrees.
However, young Henry Hussey remembers a lot more detail. He wrote,
On reaching the line, the usual interesting proceedings were enacted, the most harmless of which was the placing of a hair or silk thread across the lens of the telescope, in order to convince the most simple and sceptical that we were actually crossing the veritable locality. The bursts of laughter that followed the exclamation of the delighted and satisfied ones of, "Oh yes, I see it," were of course quite natural on the part of those who were aware of the delusion. As the day proceeded and Neptune made his appearance, matters assumed a far more serious aspect. The sailors found that some of those who were below would not come on deck to be shaved, etc., and they determined to bring them up by force. The rule, with reference to this barbarous custom, was that any who had previously crossed the line were free from the penalty of shaving, etc. Instead of making proper inquiry as to those who could and those who could not claim immunity, they proceeded indiscriminately to take one and all. Some, who had never paid their respects to Neptune, determined that they would not do so on this occasion, and when the sailors came below with ropes to haul up those who would not comply, pistols were presented with an intimation that anyone who resorted to force would be shot. One, Mr. Gillett, who had no pistols, had a wooden leg which he quickly unstrapped, and holding it up, threatened to bring it down upon the head of the first man who attempted to interfere with his personal rights and liberties. Matters were getting more and more grave, and I was told to go up quietly and inform Dr. Mayo of what was going on below. The worthy doctor was soon on the scene, and exercising his authority, the sailors were ordered on deck, and tranquility was speedily restored.
Oh, well, thank goodness for Dr. Mayo. It seems like it was a scary day for those who didn't want to participate in the hazing event.
Yeah, it seems that not everybody enjoyed the day.
Now, you haven't mentioned the ship's captain, Captain Freeman, yet. I do recall from a previous episode that he didn't cover himself in glory during the pirate attack. Am I correct in assuming that the captain wasn't really up to the task?
Well, Mayo makes plenty of comments about the captain in his diary. I don't think Captain Freeman would have liked these comments to be passed on to his employer.
Such as?
Well, even before they set sail, when everybody was getting themselves settled on board, Mayo wrote in his diary.
Wednesday, February 21st. Went on board the Asia to see my berth. It is very small. Met the commander, Freeman. He seems rather groggy about his legs.
Well, that sounds like Freeman was drunk. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. Here are a few more of Mayo's diary entries about the good captain.
Wednesday, March 20th. Captain Freeman, our commander. At 50 or thereabouts, a jolly cock enough, fond of brandy and water, and looks to the main chance. 2 of his sons are with him. One, Will, aged 14, sleeps with him in the starboard after cabin. The other, Benjamin, aged 19, is the third mate and serves out the rations, etc. to the migrants. Monday, April 1st. Over the grog at night, our captain told some uncommon tough yarns of pirates. Saturday, April 6th. Captain Freeman takes it very easy, eats, drinks and sleeps, and thinks the voyage will terminate sometime. Saturday, May 18th. Our captain takes his whack of grog daily, and in the evening, he's very fond of discussing religious subjects after several glasses of brandy and water, and enters well into its benefits as a spiritual discerner. Thursday, May 30th. The ship rolls very much. It is a great difficulty for our captain to get to a blowing up point, but when he does begin, he is determined to have enough. Thursday, June 27th. Captain Freeman stopped the grog of the Seaman Hudson for calling the Asia a floating workhouse.
Okay, well, that sounds a bit rich. The captain stops one of his crew from drinking on board, when it seems the captain himself was almost always drunk.
Yeah, I agree. And Mayo has even more to say about the captain and his drinking.
Tuesday, July 2nd. A tremendous bout of singing this evening. Even our old captain and me became very toesy into the bargain. A taste for vocal music. Saturday, July 6th. Cloudy, squally and very strong gusts of wind during the night. Our captain did not get up, and therefore we made better work of it. We should have been close reefed otherwise. Wind shifted from northwest to south, taken in sail, ship very uneasy from the sea. Friday, July 12th. Our captain has a most ungentlemanly manner in argument, whether to ladies or otherwise.
Okay, on the previous episode you hinted that a near disaster happened when they reached the western end of KI. Did Captain Freeman's drinking problems contribute to that?
Let's let those on board tell us what happened. Let's start with Dr. Mayo. He wrote in his diary,
Sunday, July 14th. Just after midnight, from not having steered high enough during the day, unable to weather Cape Border of Kangaroo Island, and our captain, being nearly drunk with brandy, could hardly be persuaded it was land and would have run us on the breakers if it had not been for Captain Duff. We then went about. He was such a fool as to try to weather the Cape again in an hour, and again very nearly ran us aground. By that time, we had drifted so much to leeward that without a shift of wind, we could not weather the Cape. Wind northwest. An awful squall of hail at noon, and soon, after of rain accompanied, with a shift to west of wind. Ship put about, and after much trouble and anxiety, weathered Cape Border at 6 p.m, and when it bore us south-southeast, we headed east-northeast. Captain Freeman looked sheepish after last night's folly. No prayers today. If the wind had not shifted to the west, our situation would be very unpleasant. The old Asia, when close hauled, goes as much to leeward as ahead. Monday, July 15th. Lovely mild morning, like summer in England. Off Point Marsden at 7 a.m, Cape Jarvis in sight, almost in calm. Captain Duff up all night, our captain in bed.
Mayo was not pleased with the drunken behaviour of Captain Freeman. His lack of action almost caused the Asia to sail right into the western end of KI. Mayo was not the only one to comment on the captain's performance near Cape Border. Henry Hussey wrote about the drunken captain and the efforts of others to save the ship.
After we had been at sea upwards of 4 months and a half, we were told that we would sight land in a day or two, which was really good news, as we had not seen such a sight since leaving England. This announcement was followed by something like a carousal, and at the critical time of all others, when those in command ought to be in a position to navigate the vessel, they were totally unfit to do so. After sighting land, the course steered actually took us soon after dark within a short distance of the rocks off Cape Border, so near that the breakers could be seen and heard. Seeing the imminent danger to which we were exposed, Captain Duff and my father took upon themselves to have the vessel's course altered with all possible speed, and after a few moments of painful suspense, the ship was put about and was headed seaward again. After daylight next morning, we made for Investigator Straits and had the pleasure of sailing along Kangaroo Island, which was in sight nearly all day. Next morning, we sailed up the Gulf, and as it was the middle of July, the land in sight looked at its very best.
A very perceptive young fellow. Now, just as well Captain Duff was on board because he was familiar with the area, having sailed there previously, and knows KI, and luckily for the passengers, Captain Duff had the additional advantage that he wasn't drunk.
Yes, that's quite an advantage. The diary of Dr. Mayo and the reminiscences of Henry Hussey and Thomas Frost give us a good insight into a voyage from England to Australia in the 1830s. During those many months at sea, prolonged periods of tedium can be broken by short periods of intense fear and grief. George Mayo's diary offers an insight into the daily lives and the associated gossip of life on board the Asia. In our next episode, we'll talk about how John Watts's plans eventually all came together, and then his voyage bound for South Australia.
Okay, thanks for listening.
So it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.